Welcome back to Sociology Droids. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today we're tackling Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Hochschild.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good one. Lots to unpack there.
For sure. But we're going to try to hit those core arguments, methodology and...
The case studies.
Yeah, the case studies. Those are always so fascinating. So what is it like? What's the big thing with this book? What's Hochschild trying to get at?
Well, she starts off, with this thing she calls the Great Paradox. It's all about why people, especially in heavily polluted areas, would be against environmental regulations. Wouldn't you want cleaner air and water?
Right. Seems so obvious, but I guess that's why it's a paradox, right?
Exactly. And she really digs deep into that, why people's their actual lived experiences might not match up with what seems logical from the outside.
So how does she go about figuring all of that out?
Well, she uses a bunch of different methods, which is cool, focus groups, tons of interviews, participant observation. She even looks at government data and media coverage to get the bigger picture,
Oh, so it's not just anecdotal. She's really trying to get a comprehensive view.
Totally. And it's all focused on this specific region, Lake Charles, Louisiana.
Okay, so why Lake Charles? What's so special about it?
Well, it's kind of the perfect example of this whole paradox thing. It's super industrialized, petrochemical industry mostly, and there's a long history of pollution. So it's the ideal place to see how those conflicting ideas play out, right?
Yeah. It's the problem in action.
Exactly. One resident even said something like, we're the buckle on the chemical belt.
Wow. That's a powerful image. Okay, so we've got the setting, the methods, but what about the people? I know Hochschild uses some really interesting case studies to kind of bring this paradox to life.
Yes, and they're so vivid. There's Lee Sherman, the former PPG worker.
Oh, yeah, he's the one who...
admitted to secretly dumping toxic waste
Yeah.
into Bayou Don.
Right, and then later on joins the Tea Party and becomes, super anti-government.
It's wild.
What? How do you, reconcile those two things?
Well, that's where the deep story comes in.
Okay, so let's talk about this deep story thing. What is Hochschild getting at with that?
So it's kind of okay, you can't just look at the surface, the facts or whatever. You have to get at the emotional core of what people believe. She calls it a feels as if story. It's the story that your feelings tell.
So less logic, more emotion.
Yeah, it's about getting at that gut feeling that drives people's beliefs, even if it doesn't seem totally rational. It's she says, it's a story that conservatives know is true, but don't really know how to say it out loud.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And what's the main theme of this deep story?
Basically, it's this feeling of being strangers in their own land. They're being left behind economically and culturally while everyone else is getting ahead.
So it's that sense of displacement, the American dream is slipping away.
Exactly. And they feel like nobody's even noticing, let alone trying to help. And then there's this metaphor she uses, the line cutters.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that.
It's such a good way to visualize it. You're waiting in line, right? You've been working hard, playing by the rules, and then all these people start cutting in front of you. It's not fair.
Yeah, you'd be pretty angry.
Exactly. And that's how a lot of people on the right see things. They feel like minorities, women, immigrants, anyone who gets help from the government, they're all cutting in line and getting ahead unfairly.
And the people who've been patiently waiting, they're getting pushed further and further back.
Exactly. And that ties into another key idea, the honor squeeze.
Right. So what's the honor squeeze all about?
It's basically this feeling that, especially white working class men, they're losing status and respect while everyone else seems to be gaining it.
Their place in society is being threatened.
Exactly. Their traditional roles, their values, their whole way of life, it's all under attack, or at least that's how they feel.
So it's not just about economics. It's about a whole sense of identity and belonging.
Exactly. And Hochschild doesn't just look at individuals. She also looks at how institutions play a role in shaping all of these feelings, like industry, government, the church, the media.
So let's break those down a little. Let's start with industry. What role does industry play in this whole deep story?
Well, in Lake Charles, it's mainly the petrochemical industry. It's like the lifeblood of the community.
Yeah.
Provides jobs, a sense of security.
Right, but it also pollutes.
Yeah, and often downplays the risk. So it creates this weird situation where people are dependent on it, but also resentful of it. And that resentment often gets directed at the government.
Like the government should be doing more to protect them.
Right, but there's also this deep distrust of the government, this feeling that it's intrusive, overreaching, and more concerned with helping those line cutters than the people who are struggling.
It's like a catch-22. They need the industry, but they resent it, and they don't trust the government to fix it.
And that distrust is often fueled by the way the government is portrayed by, you guessed it, conservative media.
Oh yeah, the media plays a huge role in all this, doesn't it?
Totally, especially conservative media. It constantly reinforces that feeling of being left behind, of being disrespected, of having your values ignored.
And it feeds into that distrust of anything that's seen as mainstream or liberal.
Exactly. It creates this echo chamber where those fears and anxieties just keep getting amplified.
So we've got industry, government, media, all kind of playing into this deep story. What about the church? How does religion fit in?
Oh yeah, the church is super important in this community, provides a sense of belonging, moral guidance, that kind of thing. But it can also reinforce traditional values and a worldview that's very suspicious of change.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword. It can provide comfort and support, but it can also contribute to that sense of feeling threatened by the outside world.
Right, and a lot of the folks Hochschild spoke with felt like their faith was under attack by a secular liberal culture, which just added to that feeling of alienation. Well, so yeah, it's super complex.
So we've got this whole web of factors, all interconnected, all contributing to that feeling of being strangers in their own land.
And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to uncover in Hochschild's analysis.
Oh, I'm definitely ready to dive deeper.
Me too. Let's keep going. All right, so we're back, digging deeper into strangers in their own land.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in this whole idea of the emotional geography of politics.
Oh, that's such a fascinating concept, right? How your surroundings and experiences actually shape your political views.
Yeah, it's not just about logic and facts, but about how you feel about those facts.
Exactly. It's like Hochschild says, your political beliefs are totally tied up with your sense of place, your community, your whole way of life.
And she uses some really interesting case studies to illustrate this, like Janice Areno.
Oh yeah, Janice. She's a great example. She's this successful accountant, staunch Republican, really believes in hard work and all that.
Right, but she also lives in a super polluted area and consistently votes against environmental regulations.
Yeah, it seems kind of contradictory, right?
Totally. So how does Hochschild explain that?
Well, it comes down to loyalty. Janice feels this really strong sense of loyalty to her community and to the industries that provide jobs there.
So it's not just about her own personal interests, but about her sense of belonging.
Exactly. She sees any criticism of those industries as a betrayal of her people, her way of life. She even told Hochschild something like, I love my culture. I love the people in it.
That's powerful. And this loyalty is tied up with her faith too, right?
Oh, absolutely. For a lot of people Hochschild talked to, faith and patriotism are totally intertwined.
So for Janice, government intervention becomes this symbol of an attack on her values, on her whole way of life.
Exactly. It's not just about clean air and water anymore. It's about something much bigger.
And that ties back to the waiting in line metaphor, doesn't it?
Totally. It's like she's worked hard, played by the rules, and now it feels like the government is rewarding the people who cut in line.
And that creates this deep resentment, this feeling of being cheated.
Exactly. And who are those line cutters? Well, for a lot of the folks Hochschild interviewed, it's minorities who benefit from affirmative action. Women who they think are taking jobs from men, immigrants.
So basically, anyone they perceive as getting ahead unfairly.
Yeah, and it's all amplified by the media, which is constantly feeding them these stories about cultural decline, economic anxiety.
It's like they're trapped in this echo chamber of negativity.
And it feeds into that sense of the honor squeeze, that feeling of losing status and respect.
It's like all these different forces are converging to create this perfect storm of alienation and resentment.
Yeah, and Hochschild found that the people who were most drawn to the Tea Party, they were the ones who felt the most betrayed by the government.
Like the government had switched sides and was now working against them.
Exactly, and that betrayal is made even worse by the feeling that their values are no longer respected, that they're being looked down on.
Which brings us to another interesting concept. The emotion rules.
Mm.
What are those all about?
So this is where Hochschild gets really sociological. She's saying that different groups have different unspoken rules about what feelings you're allowed to show.
Like, some emotions are acceptable and others aren't.
Yeah, and in these communities, there's a big emphasis on being tough, self-reliant. You don't complain, you just deal with it.
So even if you're struggling, you keep it to yourself.
Exactly. And Hochschild thinks this plays a role in their reluctance to seek help from the government.
It's like a sign of weakness to admit you need help.
Yeah, and it creates this disconnect with people from different backgrounds where it's more normal to talk about your problems.
Like they're speaking different emotional languages.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it makes it that much harder to find common ground.
And Hochschild's point is that we often miss this emotional dimension of politics, which makes it even harder to bridge the divide.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the facts and logic, but that doesn't address the underlying feelings that are driving these beliefs. And that's where empathic listening comes in.
Right. Trying to see things from their perspective, even if we don't agree.
Exactly. It's not about changing their minds. It's about understanding where they're coming from, recognizing that their fears and anxieties are real, even if we think they're based on misinformation.
So it's about building empathy, creating a space for dialogue.
Exactly. And that's what Hochschild's trying to do with this book. She's not telling us who's right or wrong. She's helping us understand how we got to this point.
So we can start to have those difficult conversations, the ones that might actually lead to some kind of understanding.
Yeah, and maybe even some solutions. It's a tough task, but I think it's worth trying.
Welcome back to Sociology, droids. We're wrapping up our deep dive into strangers in their own land. We've dug into the deep story, the emotions, and now I'm curious, how does Hochschild tie all of this to, like, the bigger picture of American politics?
Well, she doesn't just leave it at individual feelings, right? She looks at how institutions and power dynamics, all that stuff contributes to this sense of alienation and resentment.
Right, like how those folks in Louisiana see the national scene.
Exactly. And one of the big things she focuses on is the media, specifically conservative media. We talked about that echo chamber effect earlier.
Yeah, how it can really distort people's perceptions of reality.
Totally. Hochschild argues that places like Fox News, they really shape and reinforce that deep story we've been talking about. A lot of her interviewees got their news almost exclusively from those kinds of sources.
So they're constantly being fed this narrative of, like, decline and anxiety.
Yeah, and they're told that liberals are elitist and out of touch, that the government's more interested in helping, those line cutters.
Which plays right into that feeling of being left behind.
Exactly. And it explains why they're so distrustful of the mainstream media.
Like they feel like nobody's listening to them, nobody understands their struggles.
And it goes even deeper than that. A lot of them feel like their whole culture, their values, are under attack.
By a secular, liberal culture.
Yeah. So they turn to these sources that validate their worldview, that make them feel like they belong.
It's like they're seeking out information that confirms what they already believe, even if it's not accurate.
Yeah. And Hochschild gives this example of how a lot of her interviewees thought that the number of federal employees had gone way up under Democratic presidents.
But that's not true.
Nope. The numbers actually went down. But that's what they believe because that's what they were hearing.
So it's this disconnect between perception and reality that makes it so hard to have, like, any kind of productive conversation.
Right, because even if you show them facts, they've been primed to distrust those sources.
It's like you can't even agree on a shared set of facts.
And Hochschild's not letting liberal media off the hook either, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What does she say about them?
She says they tend to dismiss conservative viewpoints as just being ignorant or bigoted without really trying to understand where they're coming from.
So it's like both sides are contributing to the polarization.
Exactly. And that makes it even harder to solve problems.
Okay, so media plays a big role. But what about religion? We talked about that a bit before.
Yeah, religion's super complex. For a lot of the folks Hochschild interviewed, it was a huge source of comfort and meaning.
Community, moral guidance, all that.
Right. But she also points out that some religious beliefs can kind of line up with those political narratives we've been talking about.
Like the emphasis on personal responsibility, maybe?
Exactly. Which can lead to skepticism about government programs, Like, if you're struggling, it's your own fault.
So religion can be a positive force, but it can also be used to justify things like inequality.
Yeah, it's tricky. But Hochschild's not trying to say that religion is the problem. She's just saying that it can get intertwined with political ideology.
Right, and that it can shape how people see the world.
Exactly. Like, some folks might see environmental problems as, like, signs of the apocalypse rather than something we can actually fix.
It's a reminder that we all have these different lenses that we're looking through.
Yeah, and those lenses are shaped by our beliefs, our experiences, the media we consume, all of it.
So with all these factors at play, all these deep-seated anxieties and divisions, is there any hope of bridging the gap?
Well, Hochschild thinks it's a long shot, but she does offer some hope. She thinks the first step is what she calls empathic listening.
Trying to understand where the other side is coming from, even if we disagree.
Yeah, and resisting the urge to just dismiss them as stupid or evil.
Right, it's about recognizing that their feelings are valid, even if their conclusions aren't.
Exactly. And it's about remembering that even if we have different solutions, we all want a better future.
We're all in this together, as cheesy as that sounds.
It's true, though, and we need to be able to have these tough conversations, the ones that make us uncomfortable.
And be willing to admit that maybe we don't have all the answers.
Totally. And Hochschild's book gives us some tools to start doing that. It helps us understand how we got here, which is the first step to moving forward.
So it's been a deep dive for sure. Strangers in their own land is a lot to process.
Definitely thought-provoking, gives you a whole new perspective on American politics.
And that's what we're all about here, Sociology Droids, right? Making you think, challenging your assumptions.
Exactly. So keep those sociological minds engaged, folks.
This is Sociology Droids signing off.